Dogfighting is a horrible animal welfare abuse. Sometimes they have been clubbed to death or shot or abandoned and left to die. We slaughter about 80 billion land animals around the world each year. That's 10 times the human population of the earth. And I think if most people were aware of the cruelty involved in the production of most meat products, they would certainly choose an alternative. It's a pretty inhumane way to raise animals for food, unfortunately. We think that Jack the Ripper was most likely an abattoir worker.
Andrew, people are confused, very confused. We have vets recommending prescription diets. We have vets recommending kibble, insect food, wet food, and we have highly decorated people like yourself promoting vegan dog and cat food. Many pet foods hire vets and nutritionists to promote their food. Why is vegan dog and cat food better than the others, and why?
I would say that modern vegan dog food that's been formulated by responsible companies working with vet nutritionists or other expert nutritionists to ensure that all the necessary nutrients are included, but without some of the hazards that are found in meat-based pet foods. And the obvious one of those would be animal-sourced allergens that can result in certain allergic or intolerant responses in some animals. So if you supply all the nutrients, but without the hazards which are common to meat-based diets, you should expect to see health outcomes which are as good and potentially better in some animals. And that's exactly what the studies are showing us. There are now 10 of those studies in dogs and 3 in cats. It's a pretty substantial body of evidence, and it concurs with what you would expect. So I think that's the one major reason why people ought to consider feeding these diets, because they may have better health outcomes in their animals. They're likely to be at least as good. The other major reason, of course, is really big environmental benefits as well for anyone that's concerned about environmental degradation and climate change.
You are very big on this topic. Tell me about some of the practices of the pet food industry when it comes to animal farming. I think that even big meat eaters like myself think hard about where their meat comes from. I mean, how good can a chicken be if the chicken is spat-fed corn and not allowed to move much? I've heard you talk about the issues around male chickens, for example, the beak trimming, chickens attacking each other in confined spaces. Can you please explore these for us?
Yeah. About 90% of the world's farmed animals, and by the way, we slaughter about 80 billion land animals around the world each year. That's 10 times the human population of the earth, and 1 to 3 trillion fish and marine animals. So of all the animals that are farmed, about 90% are intensively farmed. So they are crowded at very high stocking densities in very restricted, fairly barren environments with little opportunity to exercise highly motivated natural behaviours. And that might be things like scratching, foraging, exploring what would have naturally been the forest floor in the case of chickens or pigs, sometimes not being able to stretch and flap their wings or make nests, and behaviours which these animals are highly motivated to do. They're in very barren pens with minimal environmental enrichment. Being confined in these environments long term is chronically stressful for these animals. So it's a pretty inhumane way to raise animals for food, unfortunately. And as I said, 90% of all the farmed animals worldwide are kept in these sorts of conditions. So that's where the meat's coming from. The meat that's used in pet food, in most regions of the world, a lot of that will be animal byproducts. That's the cuts of meat that are not considered to be fit for human consumption for various reasons. These ingredients are of lower quality than the meat that's considered to be fit for human consumption. So I think that raises even greater concerns about actually the quality of meat going into pet food.
Let's switch back to vegan pet food. Tell me the practicalities of feeding vegan pet food. Do you choose a plant-based kibble? Do you give your pet legumes, fruits, starches raw? Do you cook them? How does it work? And how much protein, how much carbs, how much fat? Yep. Do I need to supplement their diet like with humans? That sort of thing.
Yep. I'll tell you what you shouldn't do. What you shouldn't do is go home and toss together a bunch of fruit and veg, try and supplement it and make your own diet, because unfortunately there's now quite a body of studies showing that even when expert nutritionists do this, very often the results are nutritionally unsound. Instead, I recommend that everybody today goes and gets their vegan pet food from a reputable pet food company that hopefully is working with veterinary nutritionists or other nutritional experts to make sure the diet's fully supplemented with all the necessary nutrients in the right proportions. The companies should be able to provide some kind of reasonable information about steps they've taken to ensure nutritional soundness. If you have a company that has no information, nothing on the website, won't answer any inquiries, these should be red flags and you should be looking for another company.
Right. Okay. We hear about salmonella as being associated with raw dog food. We hear about extrusion and the cooking of starches and proteins and fats at very high temperatures, advanced glycation end products. What are some considerations or risks associated with vegan dog and cat food?
Sure. You've mentioned a couple of concerns associated with raw meat diets and also the processing of pet foods. With respect to the bacteria you mentioned that have been found in raw meat diets, unfortunately, there's now around about 100 studies showing increased risks of various pathogenic bacteria and other parasites such as protozoa and eggs, and even prion protein contaminants that cause diseases like mad cow disease in raw meat diets. Hence the strong recommendations for people to take great care when handling those diets and preparing them for their animals. Despite these recommendations being published and widely promoted, unfortunately, rates of bacterial infection and infestation of dogs in households and also people that are sharing households with the dogs is much higher. There have been quite a lot of outbreaks of these bacterial infections in households where raw meat diets are fed, and there's quite significant concern about people in particular who might be immunocompromised or vulnerable in some way. So that's one of the concerns, and it's because of this that I would say no veterinarians that have studied the issue well would actually recommend raw meat diets, and there's widespread concern within the veterinary profession about the popularity of those diets because of the health hazards to the animals and also the people. You also mentioned processing of pet foods, and this is something that affects both meat-based and vegan diets, any diets that go through processing. Diets are comprised of a range of micronutrients, and some of those will be quite strong and robust, and others will be fairly fragile and can be affected by processing. Ones that you would expect to be stronger would be things like minerals. Ones that would be more fragile would be things like vitamins and some amino acids that might unravel. Now, during processing, these diets are subjected to high temperatures and chemical treatments, and the fragile nutrients can lose their biological activity. They can be damaged. So after processing, these nutrients need to be supplemented back into the diets to ensure that they're nutritionally sound. And a common example of this is the amino acid taurine. Many people are aware that taurine is required in the diet of cats, and it naturally occurs within meat. And if they don't receive taurine, then they can suffer from visual disorders, birth disorders, heart disorders, and others. So it was found back in the 1970s that commercial meat-based cat food was resulting in signs of taurine deficiency because there was a lot of naturally occurring taurine, but it was being largely destroyed by the processing of the pet food. So after processing, it was decided to add taurine back in from a synthetic source. So these diets were supplemented with taurine, and exactly the same synthetic nutrients are added into vegan pet food. So whether it's meat-based or vegan, if it goes through processing as they should be and need to for various reasons, then the product does need to be supplemented with taurine and other necessary nutrients as well to ensure that it is nutritionally sound. Both meat-based and vegan diets comprise a whole lot of plant material. People often aren't aware that meat-based diets are often up close to 50% plant-based ingredients, actually. They comprise a lot of plant material as well as minerals, amino acids, vitamins, and various additives such as preservatives, flavorants, colorants. So these all go into both vegan and meat-based diets. On top of that, meat-based diets also include a lot of meat. The vegan diets are the same as the meat-based diets without the meat and with more of everything else that's in them. But there's actually quite a lot of similarity if you realise that meat-based diets are not just meat. There's a lot of other things, and nearly 50% plant-based material in most of them, actually.
Right. Okay. I mean, you've touched on a few issues on around raw dog food, from your viewpoint. What is the case against raw? What risks do you see? What problems spring to mind? It could be environmental. It could be whatever springs to mind.
Yeah, I'd say there are three major problems with raw meat-based diets. One would be that there's been quite a body of studies showing that they're often nutritionally unsound and imbalanced, and they're likely, for example, to have plenty of protein and plenty of amino acids that are found in meat, but they often have mineral deficiencies and vitamin deficiencies. So that's the first concern, nutritional unsoundness. The second concern would be high rates of bacterial and non-bacterial pathogens, which can affect both the animals and also the people sharing their households with those dogs usually. There have been nearly 100 studies showing this, and it's, you struggle to find anything that's more clearly proven biologically than this, because as I say, nearly 100 studies showing these increased rates of pathogens. The third problem would be simply the environmental impact. We know that the livestock sector is one of the largest causes of deforestation and particularly greenhouse gas emission on the planet. So this is probably the most powerful reason in favour of using vegan diets rather than meat-based diets for pets. It's the very, very major environmental benefits that these diets can offer.
Right. Okay. The raw feeding community would say that, for example, cats are obligate carnivores, whilst dogs seem to have traits of big meat eaters, the inability to chew food, jagged teeth intended to crush bone, short GI tracts, very acidic stomachs. Why are they wrong?
Yeah, the term obligate carnivore refers to the fact that in its natural environment, an ancestral cat needed to eat meat in order to receive all the necessary nutrients in its diet. Today's modern domesticated house cat consumes body parts from a variety of animals it would never naturally hunt, including animals such as cows, pigs, and fish, with all sorts of unnatural additives mixed into formulations like dry kibble and wet food, and fed at predictable times daily. So this bears very little resemblance to the natural feeding behavior of an ancestral cat. So the fact that it might have been an obligate carnivore in its natural environment has very little relevance to a modern domesticated house cat. What is important is what it needs biologically. Cat or a dog, or in fact any species, needs the full set of nutrients required for that species. So they need to be supplemented into a vegan diet or a meat-based diet, actually, for that matter. So the full set of nutrients is required. Secondarily, the nutrients need to be adequately digestible and absorbable so they can get into the bloodstream, reach the cells in the body and be used. And thirdly, the diet needs to be sufficiently palatable so that the animals are happy to eat those diets. Successful vegan pet food companies aim to supply diets that meet all of these needs. And the evidence today indicates that they seem to be doing that very well indeed.
Right. I just heard you talk about the term biologically appropriate, where you draw the distinction between nutrients and ingredients. What does the raw feeding community get wrong about this? Because a lot of people will say, well, pea protein and protein coming from lamb, yeah, they're both protein, but one contains better amino acids, different amino acids. They catabolize differently within the liver. What do they get wrong about this?
I think there's just a lack of knowledge, which is exacerbated by people's strong beliefs in a particular position, which is made worse when they've expressed those beliefs publicly, making it harder for them to then admit they were wrong. And the lack of knowledge would be knowledge of the substantial body of scientific studies showing that raw meat diets are often nutritionally unsound and pose dietary risks. The even larger body of studies showing they're often associated with pathogens, and the lack of knowledge of the studies of health outcomes of animals maintained on vegan diets. We don't have data on every aspect of what happens to ingredients inside the body. There haven't been studies looking at, for example, the digestibility and absorbability of all of the meat-based and vegan ingredients. But even more important than that is the health outcomes in the animal. Ultimately, the most important thing is is the animal healthy at the end of the day? Can it be healthy long term? We do have those studies. We've got 3 now in cats and 10 now in dogs, and the number is growing all the time. That's quite a large body of studies, actually, overall. Some of these studies involve many thousands of animals. Some involve quite long periods of time, years, in fact, significant proportion of dog or cat lifespans. Some involve taking blood samples and looking at parameters inside the body and the nutrient levels in the bloodstream. Some involve veterinary clinical examinations as well. And there's been 10 studies in dogs showing good or better health outcomes using vegan diets, and 3 in cats. There's only been 1 so far in dogs showing worse health outcomes on vegetarian diets, and that's the oldest study with the smallest sample size and the least realistic study conditions. So the body of evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of vegan diets. But as I always say, they must be nutritionally sound. It's not okay to go home and just feed a random vegan diet that you've prepared. You must be purchasing one from a reputable pet food company that is fully supplementing to make sure that all the necessary nutrients are included.
Right. Okay. I mean, when it comes to studies, the raw feeding community has studies. We can nitpick at those. That's no problem. The kibble companies, prescription diets have so many papers supporting what they say, and obviously the vegan community will have their papers behind their beliefs and showing with evidence, as you say, that vegan diets are better for dogs or cats. That's 3 different camps. That's 3 very different camps with very reputable people, with people putting money behind the studies. How can we make sense of it all? Because obviously raw people will say, yes, they are the best. Kibble companies say, no, we are the best. We have the better papers. And you guys will say, well, we have actually the better papers.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think there's a problem with kibble per se. Kibble, is a dry formulation that could be meat-based or it could be vegan. The fact that it's kibble simply refers to a lower water content usually, which might be helpful for animals where you're seeking weight gain, or where some people think they have some benefit in achieving slightly cleaner teeth. But in terms of the nutritional content, there need not be any difference between really a kibble formulation and a wet formulation, except for the degree of concentration of nutrients and the amount of water in the diets. With respect to the studies in different areas, one thing to do is look at a study and see if it's published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal versus a study that is not published anywhere or not published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And then look at the number of studies in an area, perhaps try to get an idea of how credible the studies are. Ones that are associated with authors at good universities might be perhaps better. If there are larger numbers of animals, that can be a good sign as well. With respect to the studies of vegan diets, as I said, there's now 10 showing good health outcomes in dogs and 3 in cats, and there's only 1 study showing the contrary result. So it's not a case of, there's similar evidence in both camps. There really isn't. There's really only 1 study showing a contrary result, which is a very old, small and flawed study. In this particular study, where dogs were forced to run on treadmills for 2 hours a day non-stop at 12 kilometres an hour after being forced rested for about 6 weeks. So it bears very little resemblance to the lifestyle of a domesticated dog, hence inability to predict those lifestyles very well. So, it's not the case of there's any kind of equivalence in the evidence in the different camps. Likewise, with raw meat-based diets, there's literally around about 100 studies showing increased rates of bacterial and non-bacterial pathogens in raw meat diets, and increased risks for both dogs typically and people in those households. And there is no equivalence of evidence on the other side. There is nothing like a body of evidence of any remote equivalence whatsoever on the other side. In fact, it's rare to find any area in biology where you have 100 studies clearly supporting a particular position, but we do on this, and they clearly tell us that raw meat diets are highly risky. It's very common to have increased rates of bacterial and non-bacterial pathogens in dogs and also people in those households. So there's no serious scientific dispute in this area at all. There would be claims made by people who are not aware of the scientific evidence in this field or are making claims that are contrary to the evidence for their own reasons. But there's no genuine question about the strength of the scientific evidence and which direction it lies in these fields.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about dogfighting. It's estimated that around 30 organized dogfights happen every week here in the UK, although the number might be higher. Apparently, winners of these illegal fights can make up to £100,000 per fight. Training methods for these dogs, the lack of veterinary care, etc. Can you shed some light into this? What can be done?
Yeah, dog fighting is a horrible animal welfare abuse that seems to be increasing in prevalence in the United Kingdom. And you've mentioned the very high rates of money that presumably just a few of these fights are able to offer to the winners, but which helps to increase their popularity. It's extremely abusive. It starts with the way in which the dogs are kept and housed. They're not housed in loving households with normal social contact with other dogs and people, but rather they're often not properly socialized and denied good veterinary care as well. The training methods are quite abusive. They may be forced to run on treadmills for long periods, lunging at lures or even other animals such as kittens in order to try to strengthen their shoulder and leg muscles. They're trained to drag heavy objects around. When they engage in these fights, they obviously become quite severely injured sometimes. If that is the case, because the injuries have been illegally obtained, they're not usually taken to veterinarians where they might be reported to authorities. They will more usually be treated with crude methods such as super glue, people attempting to sew up wounds themselves, staples and things like that. Animals that lose fights are sometimes badly abused by their owners because they are considered to have dishonoured their owners. Sometimes they have been clubbed to death or shot or abandoned and left to die, even tied to railway tracks. Ridiculous and horribly cruel ways to treat these animals. So it's a disgusting industry. It's a disgusting abuse of animals. Clearly, we need to be ensuring the penalties for this kind of behaviour are appropriate and increased, but I would argue that even more effective than penalties would be widespread education about animal welfare actually in schools, teaching people about how wonderful these dogs can be and about what is appropriate care for these animals and seeking to encourage positive attitudes towards the animals we share our societies with and also other people. There is a humane education movement that seeks to encourage positive behaviours and develop positive attitudes, and we don't resource that well at all in the United Kingdom, and animal welfare is not a required part of the curriculum here, despite the clear social benefits it can provide. So that, I think, would be even more effective, actually, than increasing penalties.
When it comes to like welfare, what would you focus on? What would you do?
As I said, I think one of the most important things that we could do is seek to educate children and young adults about animals, their needs, what wonderful companions they can be, and also how to really safeguard their welfare. We could do other things like provide subsidy services for low-income communities where people might struggle to get veterinary care, and also a really other important thing, which is behaviourists and socialisation for young dogs to ensure that they do not become aggressive, they become confident, well-behaved and happy with other dogs and people. Socialisation of animals when they're young is really important, as is appropriate preventative healthcare, vaccinations, flea and worm control, and especially neutering of animals when they're young as well. So these services aren't always available in all communities. Not everyone can afford them. So it would be good to see the importance of animals reflected in our social policies, including through subsidised veterinary care to communities that need those, and particularly education services, so people understand the importance of things like socialisation, looking after dogs properly, and absolutely not abusing them.
You have spoken out about against animal experimentation, writing a book and advocating against it. Many industries have experimented with different animals, the beauty industry, big pharma, etc. You have written a lot about it, starting in 2011, unless I'm mistaken. The cost and benefits of animal experiments. Can you give me an overview of this and why you're against it?
Yep. Invasive experiments on animals are most commonly justified on the basis of claims that these experiments are important for advancing human healthcare. But when you actually go and test or examine these claims, you find out that they're very often false. And the way that I and other researchers have done that is by searching the scientific literature, the published scientific articles. We find published reports of animal experiments, and then you look at what happens after that. You look at how often those reports are actually used by further scientific publications, and in particular, the ones that describe new treatments for human diseases. And if those experiments are never used or rarely used, then we can conclude that they haven't contributed very much actually to the development of cures for important human diseases. Now, this has been done a lot of times now. We're talking about tens of these studies, and they're called systematic reviews. They aim to systematically study all of the scientific literature in an area without anything that might bias the outcomes. So there's many of these systematic reviews that have been done now, and they invariably find a couple of things. One thing is that the rates of actual use or particularly benefit of the animal experiments is really low. I wouldn't say it's zero, but if you're looking at a tool for trying to advance human healthcare, then it's a really inefficient tool. It very rarely seems to provide the kind of benefits which are hoped for or claimed in funding applications and applications to ethics committees to please allow the research to occur. They're very often fairly wild claims about the likely benefits, but when you scrutinise those, the claims don't stack up. The second thing that's very commonly found in systematic reviews of animal experiments is actually scientific flaws. When we looked at studies of human patient populations and clinical trials in people of proposed drugs, more than 2 decades ago, we found that outcomes were being affected by a range of scientific flaws. Failure to use sufficient sample sizes, failure to randomly assign patients to different treatment groups, failure to use statistics properly when analysing results, and so on and so on. And so guidelines were published to fix these problems up within human clinical research, and the problems got fixed up. And nowadays, human clinical research is conducted to a good standard. It's been found that the same problems affect animal research as well, and guidelines have also been published to fix this up in animal research. The trouble is they haven't been complied with. These problems are still rife throughout animal research. So the results of that is that the research is often unreliable, and when you do a study of, let's say, a test drug in a population of animals, and later you repeat the same study in the same lab or a different lab, very often you can't replicate the results. You cannot repeat the results. So it shows that the first set of results was unreliable, actually, and that's because the science itself, the scientific research, is often done very badly with a lot of flaws. So that's the second really common finding that comes out of the systematic reviews. We know exactly what the flaws are: failure to use statistics properly, to randomise animals to treatment groups properly, using the right number of animals, and so on and so on. We've published, recommendations to fix all this up, various researchers who studied this field, but the lab animal community has not responded. The problems remain rife, so the results of this research remain unreliable, and that may be part of the reason why it so rarely seems to actually produce anything useful in terms of combating human diseases. There are other ways for combating human diseases that are probably much better use of society's money and much more likely to help patients. And these other ways are where the research money really should go.
Right. Okay. So in the case of the beauty industry and big pharma, what animals would be tested on? and why is this not a good practice at all?
So the animals that arguably would be most predictive for human outcomes would be primates, particularly great apes such as chimpanzees. They're the species that are most closely related to humans and ought to most reliably predict human outcomes. Trouble is, primates are also very advanced in terms of their mental, social, communicative characteristics, and have these confer extra ability to suffer in labs when they have better ability to remember and understand that certain people, procedures, and equipment are likely to cause them further suffering. So primates are used much less in labs, and especially great apes, because of these concerns, and also simply because they're very expensive and very hard to get. When they are used, they will often be used in tiny groups, such as 2 animals or 5 animals, which actually means the group is not big enough to reliably predict what would happen in a whole population of primates, let alone human beings. So even though those species would be most predictive for humans, instead of using primates, the most commonly used species are mice, rats, and birds and rabbits. And this is because these species are cheap and widely available. And if you want to do a lifetime study, well, the lifetime of a rodent is about 2 years. So you can actually do it within a reasonable time frame. Now, all of these things are logistical benefits. They make it easier to acquire the animals, use them in large numbers, and run the study. But they're not scientific benefits. Actually, these animals are much more distant from human beings, and the results are even less likely to reliably predict human beings. So those are the species most commonly used. They're not used for scientific reasons. They're just used for reasons of convenience, cost, and so on. And the results of using these species in nearly all animal research means that the outcomes are very unlikely to successfully predict human beings.
Do you think the consumer can be incentivized to pay a bit more for ethically sourced shampoos or cosmetics or whatever? Or is there going to be always a sector of the population who don't really care as long as the product is cheap? Because obviously there are going to, you need to cut corners somewhere. There have to be compromises. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, I think very few people out there are cruel or sociopathic. Most people are caring people who support these harmful industries simply because they're unaware of what really goes on inside these industries. I think if most people were aware of the cruelty involved in the production of most meat products, and also things like pharmaceuticals and cosmetic products that are being tested on animals, they would certainly choose an alternative, even if it cost a little bit more. And indeed, that's what surveys do indicate whenever people are surveyed. So there's a bit of a problem, which is that consumers are not being informed. Labeling is not sufficient on products so that people have an accurate understanding of what's gone into those products. And we need labeling that does indicate the animal welfare standards involved, and perhaps also other concerns such as the environmental impacts. Some of these industries, for example, livestock, have major damaging environmental effects. So labeling that would also indicate that. And some have argued also conditions for workers in those industries. Sometimes there are very poor conditions for those as well. So it would be great if there was labeling that was widely available, simple and clear, that didn't require consumers to read a lot of information because people don't usually have time, but enable them to exercise choice when purchasing. Very often they don't have choice. There aren't alternatives, and the information provided is not sufficient for them to make that choice. So I think it's about empowering consumers to purchase in ways that concur with their personal values and concerns, because most people do have the right values. They just aren't given that choice, and the truth is being hidden from them by industries that profit from maintenance of the status quo.
Yeah. Do you think that would apply to pet food as well? I mean, vegan pet food, complete and balanced. Raw pet food, complete and balanced. And there's huge disparities as well within those two categories. And then you have kibble. where you get 4% and then meat and animal derivatives, and you get 85% meat, 15% botanicals, complete and balanced. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the common thing you've identified is complete and balance. And so from a nutritional perspective, consumer needs to be looking at the packet and making sure that it does say complete and balanced so that it's safe to maintain their animal on that diet long term. But consumers also care a lot about the environment and animal welfare. We know, for example, that the benefits for the environment of vegan diets are really quite massive. According to a study I recently published in a major scientific journal, if all the world's pet dogs transitioned onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, you would free up more greenhouse gases than produced by the entire United Kingdom, and you would save enough food energy to feed 450 million additional people, which is more than a human population of the EU. So there are huge sustainability benefits. It's not a little difference, it's a really large difference. And for anyone that seriously cares about what's happening with the climate or the environment these days, then I think they do need to be seriously looking at this. And I think that's a great many consumers, and the numbers are only going to increase as the impacts of climate change, for example, become ever more obvious as the years pass. So as well as saying complete and balanced, we need some kind of labeling scheme on these packages that gives that information to consumers in a way that's clear, doesn't take very much of their time, and they need to be offered a choice between, the standard product that may not provide those environmental benefits, and let's say the vegan one that does provide those benefits. And we're not currently providing enough of that choice and enough of that information.
Right. Okay. Talking about primates, you wrote a paper in 2018 on ethical and scientific pitfalls concerning lab research with non-human primates and possible solution. This topic is fascinating, by the way, where you argued that the theoretical beneficiaries of this utilitarian approach is the whole of humanity, which you touched upon. Hence why it would be acceptable to inflict pain on primates. But you argue that around 1/3 of people never get to benefit from it. You then go on to suggest we implement a deontological framework instead of a utilitarian one. Can you explain this to someone who's a primate themselves like me?
Yep, sure. And of course, we're all primates. Anyway, so the utilitarian ethical framework is one that encourages us to think about the likely benefits versus harms of any choice that we might want to make. And one that has greater benefits than harms is justified according to a utilitarian framework. And that has traditionally been the framework used to assess proposed animal research. You're supposed to weigh up the benefits versus the harms. In reality, what commonly happens is that strong claims are made about the likely benefits by researchers whose careers depend on the research going ahead, on getting permission from ethics committees or funding from grant bodies. And those claims are often actually found to be untrue when you go and study how likely how useful the research actually is. The harms to animals are often also underestimated as well. The other framework you mentioned was the deontological framework, and that is the framework of rights. And we commonly apply that to human beings. And we say, for example, that even if it would benefit, a certain number of people to violate the human rights of another person, we don't consider that acceptable. It's not justified. Let's say that, some group of people might find it beneficial to just kill or torture or otherwise harm other human beings. And it's only one human that potentially would be harmed, but many humans would benefit. Under a utilitarian framework, that might be justified, but under a deontological framework, the framework of rights, we say that, people have human rights and it's not okay to inflict those harms, even if it would benefit some others. Now, with respect to primates, we argue in our study that there's sufficient abilities within primate species that they ought to have certain basic rights as well. They have advanced capacity to suffer and also to experience positive emotions. They have high intelligence compared to some other species. They have advanced social relationships with other primates and communicative skills as well. And they're actually harmed when their social networks are disrupted, they're removed from their families and their groups and forced to participate in harmful biomedical research. We argue that the basis for protecting individuals from being killed and subjected to seriously harmful research, it shouldn't just be limited to human beings. It should be limited to other beings with high intelligence, advanced capacity to suffer or to experience positive emotions, advanced social relationships, and so on, and that primates meet that standard. So we have argued that even if it would potentially benefit others, we should not be allowed to kill or seriously harm primates in the same way that we could not do so for human beings.
Right. And would you then extend that ban to other animals, all the animals? Where do you draw the line? Are pigs okay? Pigs not okay? Rats not okay? Where do you draw the line?
I mean, that's a good question. It's been pointed out by biologists that highly intelligent animals are not limited to primates. Two other obvious groups are cetaceans, dolphins and whales. The brains of large whales are enormous, and also corvids, crows, ravens, and rooks. Some of these animals have certain mental capacities that actually exceed those of human beings. Things like short-term memory, ability to recognize faces of others, ability to remember where food has been cached in the case of nuts that might have been hidden by other animals. And these abilities all help them to survive in their natural environments that they've evolved to be in. And humans haven't needed some of those abilities, so we actually don't have certain characteristics of mental abilities as well as some other animal species. So, yeah, it's a great question as to where you draw the line in terms of protection. It's made more complicated by the fact that we're only starting to really understand the biological abilities of many animal species. One of the major philosophers in the field has argued that we ought to at least consider providing certain basic protections to all mammals over the age of 1 year. He doesn't rule out providing protections to others as well, but he argues that at least in the case of mammals, and that's only one set of animals, there's several others, and at least where they're over the age of 1 year, then they ought to be afforded certain basic protections.
Why do you think veganism is on the rise? I mean, especially with younger people, you do see it a bit more often nowadays. You see many vegan restaurants. You see people being a lot more aware, or people being pescatarian, or whatever. Why do you think this trend seems to keep on growing?
Yeah, I think people are increasingly concerned about the really quite devastating environmental impacts of the livestock sector, and particularly young people who are going to be living with the consequences of climate change. Many of those people will be around at the middle of this century and indeed the end of this century. And current projections for impacts upon the climate very severe by the end of this century. So they'll actually be living with the consequences, and they're quite rightly increasingly concerned about the very serious, adverse trajectory that the planet is currently on. One of the largest causes of greenhouse gas emissions and also deforestation and freshwater use and contamination is actually the livestock sector. So it's understandable that people are increasingly concerned about that. There is also increasing awareness of the conditions in which farmed animals are routinely kept, transported and killed as well. And that's an obvious major animal welfare and ethical concern for anybody that looks at those production systems.
Right. Okay. You have also done some research on tigers at circuses. The UK banned big cats from performing in circuses. Why are you against them, and why should people care about this whenever they go on holiday?
Yes, I was asked to be an expert witness in a court case in 2023, which centered around whether it was cruel to tigers to keep them in circuses. And so As a result of that, a colleague and I conducted a systematic review of all the scientific evidence published in this field, and we found a large number of scientific studies that had looked at tigers or other big cats in circuses and zoos, and documented the welfare problems in each of the 5 recognised domains of animal welfare today, and that is housing, nutrition, behaviour, healthcare, and mental state. And all of these are compromised to varying degrees, and sometimes quite severely in circus environments. It's quite obvious that a circus is not an appropriate environment for a large cat such as a tiger to be kept. And countries that have not yet banned the use of tigers and probably other exotic animal species in circuses should clearly proceed to do so. So I was very happy to be the expert witness in that UK High Court case, which was dramatically won by the side that commissioned me to be the witness. And I hope that our published report on the welfare of tigers within circuses will be used to support other campaigns around the world to ban tigers in circuses.
Oh, cool. When it comes to other live animals, small mammals maybe, could be dogs abroad when they are sold in pet shops, big box retailers. Same with like hare and rabbits. Are you for or against this, and why?
Yeah. Anybody that is concerned with companion animal welfare would be against the large-scale commercial breeding of dogs and cats for pet stores. This industry is called the puppy mill industry. It is rife with abuse of dogs, dogs often being used as breeding machines and kept in often quite squalid conditions, with denial of certain basics of good healthcare, such as vaccinations and treatment for internal and external parasites, and also socialization so that those animals learn to behave normally in normal households and be confident, happy, and well behaved and not aggressive with other dogs and people. So the puppies that are raised in these industries in particular often are denied those basics of good care, bred in large numbers for commercial reasons, and then taken from their families at a very early age before adequate socialization has occurred, and sold for commercial reasons. So this is clearly exploitation of what is supposed to be people's best friend. People often say man's best friend, but women's as well. So exploitation of people's best friend, and it's thankfully has been banned actually in the United Kingdom. And should be also banned in other regions of the world as well. These animals should not be exploited for financial gain.
Would this apply to rabbits as well?
I think any animals which are actually bred commercially on a large scale in very poor conditions, where their welfare is being harmed, taken from their families at an early age, and where the whole industry is proceeding to make large amounts of money for a relatively small number of people, I think that is exploitation, and that shouldn't be allowed to occur.
Right. Okay. And should the consumer, because this is another thing, should the consumer be more or better informed about how to care, or maybe deterred from actually buying the rabbit in the first place? Because if you go to a big box retailer here in the UK, you see a rabbit bunny, you don't want a bunny rabbit in your house, but maybe your son or daughter does. It's mainly purchases because of the little ones. What could we do to improve awareness?
Absolutely. There should be more education about the welfare background of the animals that are being sold in pet stores, and also the welfare needs of the animals once they are taken home. For example, it's common for rabbits not to be in cages of sufficient size, to be fed the wrong diets, causing pretty severe dental problems that can result in euthanasia of the rabbits, and also to be socially isolated, which is not good either. So unfortunately, it's not in the industry's interest to be telling all the potential consumers that, hang on, your rabbit came from an environment where the welfare of its mother and the other siblings was not good, and this is all being done for commercial reasons. So you tend not to receive that kind of information in pet stores. But it is true that the vast majority of society in surveys indicate that they are concerned about animal welfare, would like more government policies, better government policies concerning animal welfare. And indeed, really, this information should be provided to children in schools so that they grow up with a good appreciation of how wonderful these animals are, their various characteristics and also needs, and how to look after them properly. If that occurred much more widely, then you would see these problems much less often.
Right. Okay. Andrew, you are the Australian Sherlock Holmes. In 2017, you published a fascinating paper called "Was Jack the Ripper a Slaughterman?" So tell us about this theory. Was Jack working in an abattoir? Just for a bit of context, because it was done a very long time ago, one theory is that Jack was a surgeon due to his ability to be precise with a knife he used with his victims. But on the paper, you suggest that first in 1888, there were many slaughterhouses in the Whitechapel area. You question whether Jack was a Jewish socher who slaughters and prepares animals according to Jewish rules. And you also talk about Jack's horrible grammar in a letter sent to the authorities, hinting that he might not have been a surgeon or medically trained.
This was a really interesting case that I stumbled upon I'm going to say it again, you can hopefully edit this out. This was a really interesting case that I stumbled onto really by accident. It started when my wife actually gave me a mystery present for my birthday, and it turned out to be a Jack the Ripper mystery tour. And I turned up at Whitechapel Station in East London at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday to discover about 30 other people apparently gathered there as well for some unknown reason. And fairly shortly, we all started what turned out to be a Jack the Ripper tour. And we wandered around the various locations where Jack's murder victims were found and were shown old grainy black and white photographs of murder victims. And the tour guide was saying that because of his speed and skill at dissection, there was a suspicion that he might have been a trained surgeon. But I looked at some of the wounds on some of these bodies, and it occurred to me that they didn't look like any surgical approaches that I had ever learnt as a veterinarian. Instead, they looked more like butchering cuts. Nothing then happened for quite a long time until I randomly met Dr. Cassie Watson, who was a historian of crime in Victorian Britain. And I told her about my theory, and one thing led to another, and we ended up doing a whole research project on this. And we found a number of interesting things. One is that, as you said, there were a large number of slaughterhouses and abattoirs in the local area in which Jack's murder victims were found. That's because in the 1880s in London, there was not refrigeration and a transportation system, and slaughtering was not industrialized on a large scale and done out of town with products shipped in. Instead, animals were slaughtered quite often during the night, so they were fresh for consumers to buy in the morning, take home and eat that day. As I said, there were no fridges back then. So there was a lot of slaughtering going on in the local area, which would have been an ideal environment to hide organs taken from victims and also bloody murder weapons. And it wasn't uncommon for people to be walking around the streets with who've just come out of the slaughterhouses as workers that had blood on their clothing and themselves. Indeed, Jack's first victim was found about 150 metres, I think, from one of these slaughterhouses. So Jack the Ripper did have an unusual degree of skill and speed at dissecting victims, and one of his victims was manhandled into a corner of a darkened square, killed, dissected, and part of the kidney stolen, all within a 15-minute period between two successive passages of a police constable through that square at about 2 a.m. in the morning in East London. So that's an incredibly fast time frame for anyone to be dissecting an animal or a person and stealing a particular organ. You need a lot of skill and experience with animal dissection to do that. However, what I spotted, which no one had described previously, is that the direction of the incision into the abdomen appeared to be the wrong direction for a surgical approach. And you could tell this by the previous stab incisions before the main incision. There were a number of other small incisions in the region of the groin. So the incision proceeded in the opposite direction to how we are taught as surgeons to proceed. But it is the same direction that you get in abattoirs, when animals are suspended by their hind legs and the abdomen is opened up and the abdominal contents are removed. There were some other characteristics of the incision which indicated that the person involved had not undergone any degree of surgical training as well, but still had a lot of speed and skill with dissection, as you would if you worked in an abattoir. The way in which the victims were killed was by throat cutting, consistent with the way that animals are killed in abattoirs and then bled out, actually. And finally, the murderer left a note, which was known to be authentic because he sent it to the authorities with half of the kidney, the other half still retained inside one of the victims. So it was known to be authentic because of this accompanying part of the kidney. And this note spoke about the satisfaction that the murderer felt when he stole the kidney from this woman, and that he took it home and ate it, and cooked it and ate it, but he couldn't actually spell the word kidney, and his general standard of English was extremely crude. So either he hadn't gone through any degree of professional training, particularly not medical training, so couldn't be a trained surgeon, or else he had a degree of imagination that, in my experience going through veterinary school, was very rare amongst the student population in a medical or a veterinary school. So these are just some of the factors that led us to conclude that he most likely was an abattoir worker. We're looking at his skill, the surgical characteristics of the wound, his linguistics, his inability to spell words like kidney, and also the demographics of the area. And on top of all of that, we know that even today, slaughterhouses tend to produce desensitization of the people working within them to extreme violence because they're constantly involved in killing animals in an industrialized way, dealing with really large numbers, which tends to numb the senses and make everything become routine. There have been a couple of major studies showing that the rates of the most serious and violent crimes spike. They're much greater in communities that have slaughterhouses situated within them. And it's thought that that is because people become desensitized to the routine commission of extreme violence upon animals, and it makes it more likely for them to go and then commit violent acts towards other people. So the slaughtering methods used in the 1880s in East London were even more barbaric than used today. They did not have the benefit of things like pre-stunning. They would use pole axes, which are basically like sledgehammers, to attempt to kill large animals, and often they would not succeed on the first attempt. So the animal welfare problems were severe, and the brutality was high, and the brutalization of people working in those conditions was considerable as well. So there are a range of reasons why we think that Jack the Ripper was most likely an abattoir worker. And because we've got evidence pointing from all these different areas, we think that this theory is more solid than any of the others that have been published so far, which tend to rely upon just one line of inquiry, such as analysis of the paper on which a note was written, for example.
Right. Okay, great. What is the area of research that you are most passionate about?
I'm most passionate about really looking at the environmental impacts of the livestock sector, and in particular the major contribution that it's making to worsening climate change, and about the potential to redress that through dietary change, through more plant-based diets. Because I think that climate change is actually the greatest threat that we currently have and are likely to have in future generations to life on Earth. We're currently living through the 6 mass extinction events since fossil records began more than 500 million years ago. These are events when more than 50% of all living species on the planet die. So since I was born, actually, the majority of all animal populations in the world have disappeared just within my own lifetime. We're looking at, wiping out the majority of the other species that we share the Earth with during as little as a few human lifetimes. And this is very much caused by our own actions. And one of the strongest contributors to this is actually the livestock sector, because of its major contribution to deforestation, biodiversity loss and greenhouse gas production. So I think this is the most important issue of our time and the times that are going to come after us, which is why it's my primary focus. And I think that diet change towards more plant-based diets is a key part of a solution. And we no longer need to be considering that just in human terms, because actually pets consume at least 9% of all livestock animals globally and probably 20% or more in wealthy nations with high pet ownership. So diet change needs to also be including pet diets now in order to make a real difference to this issue. But as I've always said, we need to be ensuring that any vegan diets we feed our pets are nutritionally sound. They do include all necessary nutrients supplemented into the diets by responsible manufacturers.
Great. Where can people find you?
I'm easy to find on the internet. If anyone searches for Andrew Knight Veterinarian, they will find me. For the key information about vegan pet food, I have all this in my website, which is called sustainablepetfood.info. It's an informational website.